Korea, in the late 1940s, sat quietly at the edge of the world's attention. A long, narrow peninsula shaped by mountains, rivers, and centuries of invasion, it had survived empires rising and falling around it. For 35 years, Korea lived under brutal Japanese occupation. When World War II ended, freedom finally arrived, but it came tangled in new chains. In August 1945, American and Soviet officers hastily drew a line across a map, the 38th parallel. It was never meant to be permanent, just a temporary solution. But lines drawn by exhausted men in distant rooms have a habit of becoming borders written in blood. Families woke up one morning to find themselves living in different countries without ever moving. Neighbors became foreigners. And Korea, unknowingly, stepped onto a path that would soon lead straight into fire. After World War II, the world didn't find peace, it found sides. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival giants, each convinced their system was the future of humanity. Europe became their chessboard, but Asia would become their proving ground. In the north of Korea, the Soviets backed a former guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung. In the south, the United States supported Syngman Rhee, a fierce anti-communist with his own authoritarian streak. Two Koreas were born, each claiming to be the only legitimate one. Both governments spoke of reunification. Both believed force might be the answer. And between them stood ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, children, caught in a global struggle they barely understood. The Cold War was no longer cold. It was moving, quietly but steadily, toward Korea. Just before dawn on June 25, 1950, the quiet shattered. North Korean artillery opened fire across the 38th parallel. Tanks rolled south. Infantry followed. For South Korea, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. For the world, it was a shock. This was no longer a civil conflict. It was the first major armed clash of the Cold War. Within days, Seoul fell. Refugees flooded the roads, carrying children, memories, and whatever they could hold. No one knew how far the war would go. No one knew who would stop it, or if anyone could. As smoke rose over the peninsula, one truth became clear. Korea was no longer a local war. It was a warning to the entire world. The speed of North Korea's advance left little time for hesitation. Within days, the United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. The Soviet Union, unknowingly absent due to a boycott, could not veto what came next. For the first time in history, the United Nations authorized a multinational military response. This was not just about Korea anymore. It was about setting a precedent. Would aggression be allowed to redraw borders by force? Under the UN flag, soldiers from across the world prepared to fight. Americans formed the backbone of the force, but they were not alone. British, Turkish, Canadian, Australian, and many others would soon bleed on Korean soil. For ordinary Koreans, this sudden internationalization of the war was confusing and terrifying. Their villages became front lines. Their fields became battlefields. And their future was now tied to decisions made thousands of miles away. The war had officially become global. By September 1950, South Korea was nearly defeated. UN forces had been pushed into a small defensive pocket around the city of Pusan. It was here, at the edge of collapse, that General Douglas MacArthur proposed a plan so bold it bordered on madness. An amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The tides were dangerous. The harbor was narrow. The risk was enormous. Many commanders opposed it. If Incheon failed, the war could be lost entirely. On September 15th, UN forces stormed the beaches. Against expectations, the landing succeeded. North Korean supply lines collapsed. Seoul was retaken. For a brief moment, It seemed the war might end quickly after all. Optimism returned. Confidence surged. And once again, Korea stood at a turning point. With North Korean forces in retreat, UN troops pushed north. The original mission, defending South Korea, quietly transformed into something else. Reunification. Total victory. Against warnings from China, UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. MacArthur believed Beijing would not intervene. He was wrong. As winter approached, confidence hardened into overconfidence. Supply lines stretched thin. Temperatures dropped below freezing. And unseen across the mountains, Chinese forces began to move. The war was about to change again. In late October 1950, the silence of the mountains broke. At night, Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River in near total secrecy. They moved without vehicles, without radios, often without winter clothing. When they attacked, they did so suddenly, blowing whistles, bugles echoing through the darkness. UN troops, unprepared and spread thin, were overwhelmed. This was not a limited intervention. It was a full-scale assault by hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers. The advance south was brutal and fast. What had looked like victory only weeks earlier now became a desperate retreat. Once again, Seoul would fall. And once again, Korea learned how quickly hope could vanish. Few battles in modern history compare to the chosen reservoir. Winter temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. Weapons froze. Wounds turned deadly within minutes. UN forces, mostly U.S. Marines, found themselves surrounded. Not just by enemy troops, but by the cold itself. Men slept sitting up, afraid they would not wake again. The wounded froze to death on stretchers. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. Yet somehow discipline held. Units fought their way out, step by frozen step, carrying their wounded with them. Chosen was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was survival, and survival came at a terrible cost. By mid-1951, the war had lost momentum, but not violence. The front line stabilized near the same 38th parallel where it all began. What followed was a grinding stalemate. Artillery duels, airstrikes, hill after hill fought over, lost, and retaken. Cities were reduced to rubble. Villages disappeared from maps. Civilians suffered the most, trapped between armies, bombed, displaced, forgotten. The war no longer promised victory, only endurance. And slowly, painfully, the world began to realize this war might never truly end. As the war dragged on, frustration grew, especially for General Douglas MacArthur. He believed the conflict could only be won by expanding it. Strikes on Chinese territory, even the possible use of nuclear weapons. For President Harry Truman, this was unacceptable. The war in Korea was meant to be limited, controlled, a test of resolve, not a trigger for World War III. MacArthur went public with his criticism. He challenged civilian authority. And in April 1951, Truman made a decision that shocked the world. The war's most famous commander was fired. It was a clear message. In a democracy, generals do not decide when the world burns. Behind closed doors, an unthinkable question loomed. What if Korea required nuclear weapons? The United States had the bomb. China did not. The imbalance was terrifying. Maps were drawn, targets marked, scenarios discussed that could erase entire cities. Ultimately, restraint prevailed, but the shadow remained. Korea became the first war fought under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. A warning shot fired, not with bombs, but with fear. The Cold War had found its most dangerous form. After 2 years of brutal stalemate, talks began. Negotiations dragged on endlessly while men continued to die at the front. Finally, on July 27, 1953, An armistice was signed. Not peace, just a ceasefire. The Korean peninsula remained divided, almost exactly where it began. A demilitarized zone replaced the battlefield. Millions were dead. Families remained separated. And technically, the war was never over. Korea became a scar on the map of the world, a reminder that some wars don't end. They simply freeze in time. When the call came from the United Nations, Turkey answered without hesitation. Thousands of kilometers away, on a peninsula most had never heard of, a new front was opening, and Turkey chose to stand there. For Turkish soldiers, Korea was cold, foreign, and impossibly far from home. But the mission was clear. This was not just about Korea. It was about honor, responsibility, and proving that a nation rebuilt from ashes could stand among the world's defenders. In October 1950, the Turkish brigade arrived. Young men in unfamiliar uniforms stepped onto Korean soil, unaware that they would soon write one of the most respected chapters of the war. They did not know the terrain. They did not know the language. But they knew how to stand their ground. In late November 1950, near the village of Kanuri, the Turkish brigade faced its defining moment. Chinese forces had broken through UN lines. Retreat turned into chaos. Turkish units were ordered to hold key roads at all costs. Outnumbered, surrounded, cut off, they fought at close range. Bayonets, hand-to-hand combat in freezing darkness. By holding their ground, Turkish soldiers prevented a total collapse of the UN retreat. They bought time with blood. Kanuri became more than a battle. It became a symbol of sacrifice, of discipline, of refusing to step back, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. Beyond the battlefield, another story unfolded, one rarely told. Turkish soldiers formed deep bonds with Korean civilians. They shared food, protected children, carried the wounded. Orphans followed Turkish units, calling them abi. Some were adopted and taken to Turkey, becoming living bridges between two distant cultures. In the midst of destruction, humanity survived, not through orders or flags, but through small acts of kindness. For many Koreans, the Turks were not just soldiers. They were family. High above the frozen valleys of Korea, another war raged, faster, deadlier, and unseen by most on the ground. This was MiG Alley, the most dangerous airspace of the early Cold War. American pilots flew the sleek F-86 Sabre. Their enemies, Soviet-trained pilots in MiG-15s, often flying from bases just across the Chinese border. The dogfights were brutal. Seconds decided life or death. Officially, this was not a war between superpowers. Unofficially, it was exactly that. Pilots never saw the faces of those they fought, only shapes in the sky. But every loss echoed on the ground. Burning wreckage, empty seats, unanswered letters. The Korean War became the first Jet Age war, rewriting how nations would fight in the future. As ground fighting stalled, air power intensified. Bombers flew day and night. Napalm turned villages into seas of fire. By the war's end, most North Korean cities lay in ruins. Dams, factories, railroads, nothing was spared. For civilians, there was no front line, only survival. Families hid in caves. Children learned to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft before they learned to read. This was modern war in its rawest form. Efficient, relentless, and devastating to those with no voice in its decisions. Caught between advancing and retreating armies, Korean civilians suffered unimaginable loss. Suspicion ruled the battlefield. Anyone could be accused of collaboration. Refugees crowded roads already targeted by airstrikes. Hunger followed displacement. Disease followed hunger. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war. Childhoods ended early. Trauma became inherited. The Korean War was not only fought by soldiers. It was endured by a nation. Far from the front lines, another battle unfolded behind barbed wire. Tens of thousands of prisoners of war, North Korean, Chinese, and UN soldiers, were held in camps scattered across the peninsula. These were not quiet places of waiting. They were battlegrounds of ideology. In the camps, loyalty was questioned. Pressure was constant. Violence often came not from guards, but from fellow prisoners. Some refused repatriation, fearing punishment or execution if sent home. Others demanded to return, no matter the risk. The question of prisoners became one of the war's most explosive political issues, one that would delay peace for years. While guns roared at the front, words flew just as fiercely. Loudspeakers blared across no man's land. Leaflets rained from the sky. Each side promised safety, victory, justice, if only the enemy would surrender. Truth became flexible. Reality blurred. Radio broadcasts crossed borders at night, whispering doubt into tired minds. Fear and hope were both weaponized. This was a war not just for territory, but for belief, for loyalty, for the future narrative of the Cold War. As early as 1951, peace talks began while the fighting continued. Negotiators met at Panmunjom, sitting across tables as soldiers died only kilometers away. Arguments dragged on for months. Borders, prisoners, symbols. Every word mattered. Every pause cost lives. The talks revealed a bitter truth of modern war. Sometimes, ending a conflict is harder than starting one. When the guns finally fell silent, no one truly won. Instead, the world was left counting. More than 3 million people were dead, the majority of them civilians. Cities lay flattened, infrastructure erased, an entire peninsula traumatized. For soldiers who returned home, the war did not end. Nightmares followed them. Silence replaced applause. The Korean War never produced a clear victory parade. Only numbers and graves. The armistice drew a new scar across Korea, the demilitarized zone. A strip of land 4 kilometers wide, heavily guarded, endlessly tense. On one side, South Korea rebuilt, slowly, painfully, then spectacularly. On the other, North Korea sealed itself off, frozen in time and fear. The DMZ became the most fortified border on Earth, a place where peace exists only on paper. The war had stopped, but it had never ended. From the same ruins, 2 completely different futures emerged. South Korea transformed itself through struggle, dictatorship, protest, and sacrifice into one of the world's leading economies. A democracy shaped by memory. North Korea chose isolation, control, militarization. The same people, the same language. 2 realities. The Korean War did not just divide land. It divided destiny. Every missile test, every border incident, every diplomatic crisis, they all trace back to this war. The Korean War taught the world how limited wars work, how superpowers fight without fighting directly, how civilians pay the price. It was forgotten not because it was small, but because it never ended cleanly. And in that unfinished ending, the modern world was born. They called it the Forgotten War, not because it lacked blood, not because it lacked courage, but because it never fit a victory story. No surrender, no celebration, only an armistice and a question mark. The Korean War slipped between history books, but it never left the world. Technically, the war is still ongoing. No peace treaty was ever signed. Only silence holds the line. 70 years later, soldiers still stand guard. Missiles still aim. Families remain divided. History rarely ends cleanly. And this war proves it. Modern geopolitics was shaped here. Proxy wars, Cold War doctrine, nuclear deterrence, all tested first on the Korean Peninsula. Every crisis today carries an echo from 1950. This was not a side chapter of history. It was a blueprint. In the end, wars are not about borders. They are about people, mothers who waited, children who grew up without fathers, a generation taught to live with fear. Their stories were never televised, but they are the real legacy of the war. The Korean War didn't end with victory. It ended with a pause. And in that pause, the world learned a dangerous lesson. That some wars don't end. They simply wait.